From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Doc Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. Show's always brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet development and website marketing for an affordable price. By Louis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. By Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. Garage Makeover is the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. And by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Got a lot to cover today. I'm going to try to keep this show on the little bit shorter side, but there's a whole lot to go through here. And, the last couple shows, we've talked about the possibility that we might be underestimating what should be expected of this team. We've looked at the first question about whether or not Florida State has addressed the things that went wrong last year. And the first question on that list, and remember those things, were stop the run the ball, decent quarterback play, catch the ball, and leadership. And we really kind of covered the two most important of those, and that's quarterback and leadership. And we addressed a little bit about how they did bring in Castellanos, and that there are some potential major upsides to him. And then some things that if things don't go right off the bat, there are definitely some concerns in terms of leadership and accountability based on how things finished at Boston College. But again, given Bill O'Brien's history, there's also, you have to kind of grade on a curve there as well. So that's going to be an interesting thing. Now, I was going to go into the next thing. The plan was for me to go into the next things in terms of have they fixed those things. I think I'm actually going to take one episode of break between now and that. So the next episode, we're going to talk about the stop the run the ball part of things. And, did they do what they need to do to be able to fix those problems? And we'll touch on that a little bit in this episode. But really, I want to get at something else that I've been thinking about as I've been chewing on the subject of the last podcast, actually, thinking about Castellanos and what may happen with him at quarterback, what they've done in terms of surrounding him with the sorts of pieces that they have around him, and not just comparing this to what they had last year, which I think, again, that's kind of almost a mistake to look at last year and say, okay, well, what have they changed from last year? I actually want to look at several other teams in the Norvell era at Florida State. And in particular, I want to look at one team that I think has the most similarities to what you have coming into this year, and that's the 2022 team. And I've found myself asking the question, if you just, again, in a vacuum, you didn't know what happened last year, and you just took the two coaching staffs and the two rosters, and you put the 2022 team in preseason up against the 2025 team in the preseason, which team would you expect to actually have a better year? I think that's a really interesting question. Because when you start to look at those teams, in a lot of ways, what they did in the offseason this year, in terms of the players that they got in the transfer portal, the kind of team that they've tried to build, the identity that they're looking to have, it's honestly pretty clear to me that they tried to use 2022 as a template. They're trying to rebuild the 2022 team, not even the 2023 team. There's some differences there with what they did in 2023 and some of the personnel that they had. Some of those guys, I mean, they're not going to add a Keon Coleman at this point. But if you look at this, and obviously this team is not going to come in with all the experience and the benefit of the track record that the 2023 team had. They came in with unfinished business after the 2022 season, and that was an experienced team with an opportunity to build on what they'd done the prior year. A bunch of guys returning, and they just had to add a couple pieces. That's not this. it's pretty clear to me that what they did is they tried to do what they did between 2020, 2021, and 2022. 2022 was the template for what they did in building this team. And I start comparing personnel to personnel, and I go, wow, that's kind of interesting. Because you think about this, you've got in the preseason, and again, we know what happened in 2022. I don't want to grade that year with hindsight. I just want to grade in terms of what we knew going in and the kinds of pieces that they had collected. They had added Johnny Wilson, who they did not have in 2021. And he was a guy that had flashed at his prior stop, but hadn't really put up numbers. Well, that's Deuce Robinson. And the guys are built the same way. Now, Deuce is actually a smoother athlete and a better natural catcher of the ball than Johnny is. Now, Johnny probably a little bit faster in a straight line, a little bit heavier athlete, but a lot of similarities between those two guys playing the same position. Then you had Pokey Wilson at the 2. That's Squirrel White. They're the same, except you can make the case that with Squirrel's background and what he's done at Tennessee, coming into the year, you'd bet on Squirrel White being the better player over Pokey Wilson. And especially in that role, the role that's the stretch the field kind of player, Squirrel White can fly. So now you've got your Pokey role. Then you're going to take Randy Pittman at tight end in place of Cam McDonald. Which one of those do you take? Actually, in this offense, and in terms of track record coming into the season, you take Pittman in that matchup every time. I mean, this is starting to look really interesting, right? Then from there, you go to the slot, and you've got Micah Pittman, who he coming in was thought to be maybe a malcontent. It wasn't clear how well he'd fit, but was kind of a glue guy who would just get open and make catches, just a reliable player, and, biggest value is as a punt returner. And in his place, you've got Javon Boggs, which Javon is going to be, he's going to be the starter in the slot, looks like. And then you've got Gavin Blackwell as another transfer in there who can potentially come in and, there's really been nothing about him coming out of camp. I don't know how much to really expect out of him, given what I saw of him at Carolina, but another guy that can really fly. Probably really backing up Squirrel White more than anything else. But you got a few other bodies. And you got Mekhi Danzy, who's a big play stretch the field guy. You've got some guys that actually are some intriguing athletes that can at least, you think, match more or less what you got from that position and from some of the backups at the skill positions in 2022. And really the question is, at receiver, can Javon Boggs match what you got in terms of toughness and ability to make the tough catches under pressure that you got from Pittman? I don't know. I mean, you're relying on a true freshman. You've got some backups that, may come in and contend for that as well if he doesn't do it. But you got to really like what you see from Boggs in terms of frame and in terms of natural hand catching and all that. But really, I mean, you look at this coming into the year, you probably favor Deuce over Johnny. You favor Squirrel over Pokey and Pittman over Cam McDonald. At worst, coming into those 2 years, not knowing what happened in 2022, you're probably calling those each a draw, if not, again, tilting toward the 2025 group. I think in the slot, maybe you give that to Pittman, and I would say I would have given it to Pittman based on his punt return career. In the slot, I'm not sure I would have given him the edge. But it makes it really interesting to look at those comparisons. And then you look at the backfield. And this is where I think the biggest gap is. I was really high on Trey Benson going into 2022, but I was one of the only ones who was really high on Trey Benson going into 2022. There were a lot of people who thought he was a mistake to even take. So a lot of people would have favored Benson, or a lot of people would have favored this backfield over Benson just because they didn't know about Benson. I think if you get anything close to a Benson in terms of athletically out of this group, it's going to have to be Chroma. I mean, Sawchuk also can fly, but Chroma is probably your closest bet there. And, he's an interesting cat in terms of you watch him run, and there's some James Wilder Jr. kind of physicality. He's wearing that in 32. Some James Wilder Jr. physicality to his running style, but he's a smoother and significantly faster athlete. Actually has some Ricky Waters in him, really. I mean, if you go back to the 49ers days or, back to Notre Dame days of a Ricky Waters type, because he's got those really soft hands and the smoothness with a little bit of that upright running style. Chroma, I mean, we didn't know what Benson would become for sure. We knew, again, I thought there was enough evidence when they took him that as long as he stayed healthy, the possibility that he could explode as a big play threat was there. Chroma is another guy where, by the second half of the season, at least, you're looking at a guy that could really explode as well. But they also have Roydell Williams. They've got Sawchuk. They've got Cam Davis. And then the guy that really gives them kind of something they didn't have in 2022 is Jalen Lucas, that utility guy who they can put in at the slot, and he can be kind of a substitute for what they got from Pittman in certain respects, but with world-class speed. Not quite world-class, but really, really fast. World-class for football speed, very good football speed. And then put him in the backfield, do all sorts of stuff with him. You're going to get a lot out of him. So you start going down the list, and on the skill side, on the offensive side, you can see that they've basically rebuilt player for player, very similar to the 2022 team, but with a few pieces that they didn't have, like a Jalen Lucas, a little bit more backfield depth. I don't think they have a Trey Benson on this roster, but we'll see what Chroma becomes. And Williams and Sawchuk could be pretty good. Then you get to the offensive line. And that's another really interesting comparison. Going into the season, what did you think you had in 2022? So here's your starters going from left to right. Robert Scott, redshirt sophomore. Dylan Gibbons, the transfer from Notre Dame. Maurice Smith, redshirt sophomore at center. Dimitri Emmanuel or Darius Washington at guard, and that's a redshirt senior and a redshirt sophomore. And then Turnitine at tackle, along with Washington also at right tackle. So compare that to this year going in. And first of all, I think there's a couple positions that you probably favor a specific guy. So we can just kind of cross those off. I think you probably favor Robert Scott at left tackle at that stage of his career going into the season. You kind of expect him to be maybe a little bit better than Gunnar Hansen, but not by a lot. And Gunnar Hansen has been at least average at the left tackle spot in the ACC or in the SEC. So, and he's more experienced. So I'm going to, out of the interest of being maybe overly fair here, I'm going to tilt that toward Robert Scott. Then you got Dylan Gibbons as a transfer from Notre Dame, and you take him against Adrian Medley. Which one are you taking? Medley has had a long track record of starting and playing at this level or close to it, and years of playing under this offensive line coach and this offensive coordinator. I think as good as Gibbons turned out to be, he was a guy that hadn't played that much at Notre Dame. And actually, if you go to hindsight, he did play a good portion of 2022 with a broken foot. So, we're not going to grade from hindsight, but I think all things being equal, you take Adrian Medley at left tackle or at left guard over Gibbons going into the season. And then, if he stays healthy, then yes, that's definitely an advantage over a broken-footed Gibbons. Maurice Smith versus Luke Pettibon, that's not even close. You're much better at center now than you were there. Then you have Meach, you have Dimitri Emmanuel at right guard, and I think you're going to take Richie Leonard there over Meach. And then Micah Pettis at left or at right tackle against Turnitine or Washington. And I think you're going to take Pettis every time. So odds are you're taking 4 out of the 5 offensive linemen from 2025 over the guys that you have from 2022. And a couple of those guys were transfers too. So it's not just a matter of like, well, you got 5 new guys, they've got a gel. You had 3 transfers on that line. So now it's starting to get interesting, right? And then, of course, you have the final piece. And we all know what Jordan Travis became. So it's really hard to grade this one going into the 2022 season because you're going, well, obviously, yeah, Jordan Travis is going to be the X factor that's going to give the 2022 team the edge in every game, right? Against the 2025 team. Comes down to Castellanos versus Travis, and you're going to favor Travis every time, obviously. But we didn't know that going into 2022. That's the thing. I remember, and a lot of people don't remember this, going into 2022, there were questions about whether Travis was actually good enough at quarterback for this program to succeed with him. There were questions about whether or not he could throw the football well enough for them to be decent. Hindsight is 2020. He became one of the best quarterbacks in the country, though never an especially, super accurate thrower, but he became really good. And, you start to look at some of the things that some of the numbers comparing Castellanos going into the season with Travis going into the 2022 season. So before 2022, you start comparing their numbers and you go, oh, they really are trying to rebuild the 2022 team. Jordan Travis going into 2022. I'm going to give you some numbers here. And I know this is hard to do without a graphic and all that, but just listen closely. Jordan Travis in the pre-2022 era, so that's before Johnny Wilson and the rest showed up. Overall accuracy numbers, so this is throws on target, 84.6% accuracy, 9.6 average air yards per attempt, 22 passing touchdowns for 6.3% touchdowns per attempt, 13 interceptions, 12 fumbles, a 24.3% pressure to sack rate, 1,635 rushing yards as the NFL calculates them, so taking out sacks, on 5.2 yards per carry and 17 rushing touchdowns. So that's what you have. Now, instead of reading off Castellanos' numbers and expecting you to be able to correlate those, what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat those, and I'm going to give you now Tommy Castellanos' numbers in his pre-2025 career. So Jordan Travis, pre-2022, 84.6% accuracy rating. Tommy Castellanos, 83.4% accuracy rating. So about 1 percentage point worse in terms of on-target throws. That's not surprising. Jordan Travis, 9.6 air yards per attempt. Tommy Castellanos, 9.9 air yards per attempt. So when you actually adjust for those, their accuracy per how far down the field they're throwing is almost a wash. Jordan Travis, 22 passing touchdowns on 6.3% of his attempts. Tommy Castellanos, 33 passing touchdowns on 6.5 touchdowns per attempt. Almost identical. It's just a matter of Castellanos having more games. But percentage-wise and all of that, overall rate is almost identical. 19 interceptions for Castellanos versus 13 for Travis. 15 fumbles for Castellanos versus 12 for Travis. And then Travis had a 24.3% pressure to sack rate. Castellanos, 23.5% pressure to sack rate, slightly better. Travis, 1,635 NFL rushing yards. Castellanos, 1,886 NFL rushing yards. Travis at 5.2 yards per carry. Castellanos at 4.4 yards per carry. Travis at 17 rushing touchdowns. Castellanos with 15. Guys and gals, have you ever seen the interview with Rogan and James Franco, where you have him saying the same, but different, but still same? That's what you have here in terms of the numbers. And that's despite last year, Bill O'Brien really trying to change him into a quarterback that wasn't really who he is. This gets really interesting, guys, because now you go player for player, and they've very clearly tried to rebuild the 2022 offense. And so much of it is going to hinge on, can they stay reasonably healthy? Can they stay healthy on the offensive line? And can Castellanos replicate some of the leap forward that Jordan Travis took in 2022? And I'm going to say something that, I said in 2022, and I said going into 2022. A large portion of Jordan Travis's improvement as a passer in 2022 and 2023 really boiled down to having better pieces around him. And look, he would have taken a step forward. I mean, the guy worked really hard. He got better as a player. But I'm telling you, without Johnny Wilson coming on to the 2022 season, you don't see the quantum leap forward that Jordan Travis was able to take. Because it was the right match to surround him with that kind of guy to make him look that much better. Same thing with Benson, suddenly providing that threat in the backfield. All of a sudden, what Travis was able to do well was force multiplied by the pieces around him. And then you added Keon the next year, and you got Keon and Johnny. And, Travis was not the most accurate thrower, but for those guys, it didn't matter that much. There's such matchup nightmares and such difficult covers that it didn't matter that much. And in 2022 with Pokey, just throw it down the field and let him go get it. Let him make big plays. Let him stretch the field. With Johnny, the deuce roll, the same thing. Just throw it up, let him go get it, and let him make sure, even if he can't get it, it's not going to be a bad play, because he's going to make sure that it's him or nobody is going to catch it. That changes what you can do. And they didn't have one of those guys last year. All of a sudden they do. So they've rebuilt effectively the 2022 offense, but with a better offensive line, I think. And a quarterback that I think you're betting on having to take a kind of step forward that Jordan Travis took. But again, you're betting on surrounding him with the same kinds of pieces that Jordan Travis needed to be able to take that step forward. You're betting on those pieces making Castellanos that much better too. So then the real question comes down to health. Number one, the 2022 team stayed reasonably healthy, although again, you had Gibbons playing on a broken foot. You had some issues, but they stayed reasonably healthy. So health is an issue. And I think, this offensive line is thin. You don't want to dip into your depth with this group. You can't really afford some of these guys to go down, but they couldn't in 2022 either. Again, they had reasonable health there, but health, number one, and number two, and again, Castellanos has to stay healthy also. But number two is Jordan Travis only threw 5 interceptions in 2022. And he didn't fumble the football a bunch either. So Jordan Travis protecting the football that much basically allowed that 2022 team to be so dangerous, because he basically became a player who, with the combination of his legs, the threat of him running, and then his ability to push the ball to those weapons and let them make the plays, by not making a bunch of mistakes and then just running the offense and being the point guard at that point and being a threat with his legs as well. Once he was not turning the ball over in that context, that offense gets really hard to stop. And that's what they're counting on. If Tommy Castellanos doesn't turn the ball over, I think this offense is going to be tough. I'm just looking at those comps. And if you could guarantee, if you could guarantee 80% of the production or the quality of the 2022 offense against this schedule with the defense that they have, do you think that'd be enough to get to 8 wins? I think that might be. And they might be better than 80% there. They might actually be, again, coming close to the 2022 team offensively. Now, defensively, it's a bit of a shift. Defensively, it's a different picture, because defensively, that 2022 team, again, going into the year, you weren't sure how good they'd be, because you weren't sure that Jared Verse was going to be Jared Verse, but you felt pretty good about that group defensively. Just again, replicate. Let's go through the roster just so that people can remember. They had Derek McClendon or Jared Verse to start in the early going there. So you had an or there between McClendon and Verse. That's kind of funny, actually. Then you had Fabian Lovett, Robert Cooper, backed up by Jarrett Jackson and Malcolm Ray or Joshua Farmer as a redshirt freshman. You had Dennis Briggs, Leonard Warner, and Patrick Payton at the Fox. Then you had Deloach, who was an or with Lundy. Those guys, neither of those guys had really stepped forward yet and become what they would become. And then you had Tatum Bethune, who was a new transfer coming over with his prior coach. Then you had Kevin Knowles and Greedy Vance at the nickel. You had Duke Cooper and Azaria Thomas, who Thomas actually then sort of slid in different places. But you had Omarion Cooper at corner. You had Akeem Dent at buck. You had Jamie Robinson at free safety. And then Renardo Green at corner. I think overall, you look at that personnel, knowing what we know now, that personnel is better than what you have on the roster at Florida State in 2025. Jared Verse ain't walking through that door, y'all. But we didn't know that Jared Verse was on that roster either. We didn't know who Jared Verse was. Not like that. And you start looking at it, Lovett and Cooper, after them, you get to Jarrett Jackson and Malcolm Ray and a freshman Farmer. Boy, they were thin on the interior. And ultimately, that's what cost them 3 losses that year. When Lovett got hurt against LSU and then Cooper got banged up as well, that killed them. And it wasn't until the next year when they added Fisk and they were able to rotate a little bit more on the interior with some quality bodies that they became the buzzsaw defensively that they were. And, you know, the other difference is that they were starting to really work with the light box concept where they were relying on the ability to dominate on the interior with their down 4 and their 2 backers and just going light box all the time to stop the pass. And they were able to do that as long as they had a Jared Verse and a Fabian Lovett and a Fisk or Cooper as well when those guys were healthy. When they were able to go light box with those guys, they were able to do that. But it was a different approach. The current approach is the opposite. This staff is saying we're not going to let anybody just run the football on us, period. And I do think the overall depth on the defensive line is better in 2025 than it was in 2022. I just don't think you have a Jared Verse. I think you do have a Fabian Lovett, or maybe even better with Jackson, potentially. So, you know, you feel good there. But what are you going to get in terms of the overall front and all of that? I think you've got some pieces that you feel really good about. Jackson, I think, he would have started on the 2022 team. James Williams, probably a starter on the 2022 team. I think at this point of his career, he's probably starting. I think he's most assuredly starting over Dennis Briggs, Leonard Warner, or a freshman Patrick Payton on that 2022 team. So that's 2 guys that on this group that are probably starting on that defensive line. I think obviously Verse is going to start over anybody on this roster. And then, you know, Jason Jenkins, him being able to be full go in the last scrimmage is enormous for this team. But Jason Jenkins, the development of Jaden Jones, who has always had talent, it's just been about the injuries. They've got some pieces that could actually be a problem for teams up front. And the biggest difference is that they're going to use the scheme to take away the run much more than what they did under Fuller. It's a much more physical, much more aggressive scheme when it comes to stopping the run. Now, they're going to have to be able to stop the pass when they do that. Teams are going to be able to get some one-on-ones against them. They're going to be able to get some matchups that maybe weren't quite, they're more advantageous than what they were able to get against Fuller's scheme in the passing game. So that's really what you're sacrificing there. And honestly, that 2022 secondary with Renardo Green, Jamie Robinson, Akeem Dent, Omarion Cooper backed up by Azaria Thomas and Kevin Knowles and Greedy Vance, like, y'all, that's a really good secondary. That's a better secondary than you've got coming into 2025. And I think going into the 2022 season, you probably felt that. I liked Renardo Green a bunch. Jamie Robinson was a dude. Akeem Dent was a 5-star recruit, highly regarded there. Azaria Thomas was already showing flashes as a true freshman. Omarion Cooper coming off a really good season. Nobody knew that he was going to have the foot problem, and ultimately just really never build on that after that. 2022, he really didn't become what they hoped he would be. He didn't really end up playing that much. And then you had Knowles and Greedy Vance there as well. Those are all good players and guys that you felt pretty good going into the 2025 season. So I think you give the edge at corner and safety to the 2022 team. And I think that's a pretty big difference. I think you give basically a split on the defensive line because of the combination of depth for 2025, where they've got a better collection of overall depth in terms of bodies. But then you got Jared Verse and you got Lovett. So maybe call it a split there. And I think linebacker wise, I think this group of linebackers is actually better than that one. Some people may disagree with me, but I think this group, especially with the depth, I think they're going to be better. So all in all, given how important the secondary is and how important depth at the defensive tackle position is, going into 2022 versus 2025, I'd have probably favored the 2022 team by a little bit defensively, but it's close. And once they had the injuries on the interior, you're going to take the 2025 team. So this has been another interesting exercise in just thinking through personnel-wise what we can expect from this group. Now, there are a few things that, I think we know at this point. I think reading between the lines of Gus Malzahn's interviews and some of these other things about the offense, I think Gus is breathing a sigh of relief right now that he thinks he's actually got an offense that can be pretty good. I think they feel like their offensive line with the 5 guys that they have can be pretty decent. I think he feels like Castellanos is actually going to be able to work for him. And I think, from some of the few reports that you're getting out of there, he's played pretty well in camp. He had a good second scrimmage despite one awful interception. And that's the thing. You're gonna have to take some bad with the good with Castellanos, but he's going to be a guy you can actually enjoy watching play quarterback and root for. That was not the case with what they were putting on the field last year. So, he's going to make plays, which they didn't get from that position last year. And every so often he's just going to drop the football, or he's going to make a throw where you're just going, what was he thinking? Why would he do that? The more they can limit that, the better the ceiling, the higher the floor and the ceiling go for this team. But I think Gus actually is starting to show some signs of like, yep, I think I actually have some real guys that can cause some problems here. Yeah, going to be difficult to stop, all the weapons that I can put in motion and do some things with. So I think that's basically what you're seeing from him. So that's interesting in itself, and I think that's encouraging. Defensively, it's going to be interesting because I think if you read between the lines after the second scrimmage, White was calling out some of his guys, and just by not mentioning them. So first of all, he basically said, we got a bunch of guys that aren't doing things the right way. They're not playing at the level that we need them to play in order for us to be successful. And, it's sad because we were hoping to depend on these guys and they're just not playing good enough. And they're not invested to be the kind of players that they need to be. And then he went through and named a bunch of guys that had been playing well and had been putting forth the necessary effort. There were some guys that were very notable by their exclusion from that list of guys that he mentioned positively after making that initial statement. Guys like Daniel Lyons, who they need, but based on prior performance and all of that and other things, you wonder, okay, is he just not going to be physical enough? Is he not going to strain hard enough for what they want? KJ Sampson, same problem. Those guys, notable by their absence in what he said. Blake Nicholson, he named a bunch of backers, but he didn't name Nicholson. Shaheem Brown, who's right now not running with the ones. Conrad Hussey, didn't name him either. So some of these guys you can read between the lines and you can say, okay, these are guys that have to actually play better. They have to actually put forth the effort, or they're going to be standing on the sideline and they're going to find other guys to play those spots. The good thing is that I think they do have some guys that can play those other spots. And with the flexibility of what they do up front, if Daniel Lyons isn't going to work out, then, Jason Jenkins, he's an edge, but he can play defensive tackle and slide inside to some too. Deontay McCray, he may just take Daniel Lyons' spot. KJ Sampson's not going to do it. Kevin Wynn's starting to show signs of being able to take some reps. So this is what you're kind of expecting here. Now, what they're hoping by pushing this a bit more and by amping up the physicality is to get some of those guys like Lyons and Sampson to actually fully get there, to strain and finally get over the hump to the last 5 or 10% of their capacity so that they can become reliable players into the season. Are they there yet? No, not even close. So they're going to find some guys that can do it. Now, this all gets real interesting because you start to think about, okay, if they did rebuild the 2022 offense, they don't quite have the 2022 defense, but if they actually have enough in terms of backers and some depth up front to be able to rotate some guys and cause some problems and cause more confusion defensively, you got a dude at corner in Jeremiah Wilson. They feel pretty good about Jabril Rawls. They feel like Earl Little's a dude at Rover and Edwin Joseph's a dude at right safety. Well, maybe actually you're getting close. And then, do you have a team that in a home game to open can actually challenge a very talented but inexperienced and, has some question marks itself Alabama team? Maybe. I don't know. We're going to find out. But I think there's more chance of that being a closer game and Florida State being able to contend than what maybe I'd have thought a couple months ago. And at worst, I think the buzz coming out of camp is that this is going to be a team that you can actually enjoy watching, even if they lose. Last year's team after the second game of the season, last year's team never looked like they actually wanted to be out there. They looked like a corpse, and it was unpleasant watching last year's team. This year's team, at least they look like they're going to scrap and fight and claw and be that kind of team, and it's hard to root against that kind of team. And then, of course, there's the other interesting factor here. Let's say they go out there and they scrap and they claw and they lose to Bama. That's not the season. They're expected to lose to Bama. Bama's expected to be, they're the most talented, along with Ohio State, the most talented roster in college football. You're expected to lose that game. Due to the low expectations, you're basically playing with house money in that game. If you win it, wow, that launches your season. Everything's back to normal in Tallahassee to some extent. But if you lose and you went down fighting, you went down swinging to a really good team, everybody just says, well, they showed some fight. And then you get a month to prepare for one of your biggest rivals, who, by the way, opens with Notre Dame, and then the game before you plays University of Florida. And here's the really interesting question. What happens with that Miami of Florida team if they lose those two games? Because that Miami team, they've got some homegrown talent on that roster too, but let's be real here. They've built just as much through the portal as Mike Norvell ever did. Despite all their holier-than-thou recruiting and all of the buzz about Norvell runs a transfer program, we run a recruiting high school program or whatever, that's not really the case. I mean, you look at their roster and it's a bunch of mercs. And, no fewer mercs than what Florida State had last year. Biggest difference is they'll go in, they will go all in. They'll put a bunch of money towards landing some top level recruits out of high school. And that's a 1-year deal for the first year. And then if that guy doesn't show that he's going to be a dude right then they basically lowball him. And then he's got a choice. He can transfer out with the reputation that, well, he's just maybe not all that good. He's going to, Miami didn't think he was good enough to retain. So he's going to lose that money on the open market, or he can stick around and re-sign for much, much less. So it winds up being a good deal for Miami. It's kind of, interesting strategy. And then they take that and they turn that around and go for transfers as well. It's a good strategy. It's what they've done. But here's the thing. With all those mercs and without the leadership of Cam Ward, see, I favor that Notre Dame team. I think Notre Dame's better than Miami. So if they lose to Notre Dame, and then what happens if they lose to Florida? Carson Beck does not strike me as the kind of leader that Cam Ward is. Not even close. And if you listen to anybody from the Georgia program, they're all glad he's gone, which is really striking to me because the guy's talented, though coming off an elbow injury. He's pretty talented physically. But normally, when you lose a potential first-round quarterback, you don't have a bunch of people from that program and surrounding that program and covering that program rejoicing to see him go and saying, addition by subtraction. I'm just saying. So what happens then if they lose those 2 games in the first month and then they come into Tallahassee at 2-2? Miami's been known to quit on people before. And now you got a bunch of mercs down in South Beach with all those distractions. Boy, this could be, I'll just say, this could be, if that happens, this could be a really good time for some schadenfreude. It'd be very high-level schadenfreude. Do I expect that happens? Actually, probably not, because I'm not sure Florida actually beats them. But it's not impossible. I think Notre Dame will beat them, and then Florida, it's, maybe a 60-40 game that I'd favor Miami in, but it's closer than you might think. And then if they come in 2-2, I mean, does Florida State actually potentially sit in a position where they actually are riding some momentum, having figured some things out? Got to stay healthy. Got to figure out how to get Castellanos to protect the football, to make sure that he plays within himself and also protects himself, maximizes your chances to win in those ways. You got to figure out who your primary ball carriers are. Do you maybe have a guy that can be a consistent ball carrier behind this offensive lineman? Maybe you have 2. It's going to be really interesting. But this is where we stand. Now, that somewhat gives away the game a little bit on whether or not I think they've fixed those other things. But we're going to talk about that in the next episode. And then after that, we're going to move out of this stage of talking, and then we're going to go to position previews and then to season previews and get ready for the season. We're pushing up into it. We're getting close to the end of the actual camp period and into Bama preparation. You got 2 weeks of Bama preparation coming up here shortly, but we're going to be prepping for the season with all sorts of fun. Until then, this has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.